So, Larry, this is three different updates that we've been providing on the channel. The very first one, we talked specifically around the FDA's published report from several weeks ago, talking about patients testing positive for a rare strain of antibiotic-resistant E. coli during a procedure that utilized a gastroscope, and that this isn't something that we've seen before. It was the very first time. And so we detailed a lot of that. Then we talked about some of the studies that you've put out on the topic, and we promised everyone that we would come back with some risk factors and maybe some recommendations. And obviously we're not going to be able to cover them all in a short period of time, but I thought we would start with maybe a sampling of some of the risk factors that people can be keeping in mind, and certainly they can reach out to you directly to have, a more thorough conversation as well.
Let's get to the risk factors and let's get to recommendations. Risk factors for a gastroscope to remain contaminated, if it's an ultrasound model, of course, might be not cleaning thoroughly underneath the elevator mechanism that those types of endoscopes feature as well, like the duodenoscope. Another risk factor might be not maintaining and repairing the scope according to manufacturer's recommendations. Of course, a third risk factor may not be reprocessing the endoscope properly. The disinfectant may not be used above its minimum effective concentration. The brush may not be properly fitting. It may be too narrow for the suction channel. So we have a lot of risk factors that focus on the inadequate reprocessing of the endoscope. Damage is one we talked about earlier. If you're using an endoscope that's damaged and failing the leak test, this is problematic. Do not use an endoscope that fails the leak test. And so recommendations, we can very conveniently map back to those risk factors, review the manufacturer's, that is the gastroscope's instructions for use, make sure that you're complying with all the manufacturer's instructions, have a quality system in place so that you can monitor and audit staff to ensure they're complying with those instructions and your policies and procedures are consistent with those instructions, and contact the manufacturer with any other questions that you have. And for more information about risk factors, and I have several more, and additional recommendations to prevent a gastroscope from infecting patients with a superbug or a multi-drug resistant organism, please reach out to me and we can fill you in more detail. We don't have enough time to do it now, but any topics related to adverse events involving flexible endoscopes and reprocessed endoscopes remaining contaminated and exposing patients to potentially life-threatening diseases, please reach out to me and I can answer all of your questions.
Yeah, I'll tell you, this conversation, to your point, can't be had in 3 minutes. And there's a lot of detail behind it. But I think really highlighting gastroscopes and other types of flexible endoscopes, as you astutely said in video number 2, we would have thought maybe it was really limited to just colonoscopes, but it is a broad sweeping conversation.
And in closing, we think that maybe in our discussions, the FDA might want to consider releasing a public alert to notify the public about the risk of gastroscopes remaining contaminated and potentially exposing patients to these multi-drug resistant organisms.
Excellent. Thank you, Larry, so much.
My pleasure.